Father Stephen Doug, would you see that in your context as well, that the revelation with Moses is different than the revelation with Adam?
No, but here's why.
Okay.
Because my understanding is that when Moses goes up Mount Sinai, he's entering paradise, because paradise is the place where God is.
So
when Mount Sinai is the mountain of God, right? He's speaking to God face to face, the way a man speaks to his friend. He's fundamentally in the same situation that Adam was in at that time.
What about when he's just prophesizing then on the regular?
Well,
I'm actually wondering, both you, Chezi, and Father Stephen, if you watched or listened to Alex O'Connor with Jonathan Pageau.
I did not.
No.
I'm not sure if I can recommend it.
I'm less than impressed with that guy in general.
Alex O'Connor, yes.
Yeah.
One person said it was Pageau at his best. I'm not sure I would disagree with that. I was there were things I would have said which Pageau didn't. It was the only time Pageau claimed it's the first and only time he has ever actually done an altar call and said, "Here, I offer you conversion to Christianity." But
he's done that 27 times with Jordan Peterson.
Really? Well, not in public.
Not publicly. Yeah.
But Jacob, would you be? And I guess this is also a question to Father Stephen DeYoung, like the God that Maimonides is offering, or let's say I didn't see this interview, but let's say the God that Jonathan Pageau is offering Alex O'Connor, he's not selling necessarily Jesus. He's selling like a he's selling a God that for an atheist or for a rationalist they could also feel comfortable with. So
no. He was selling. So the discussion was about the fall, right? Adam and Eve eating of the fruit of the tree, and like Alex O'Connor has all of these rationalistic questions on this.
You expect me to believe a snake can talk?
Well, it was one
high level stuff like that.
It was kind of like, well, why did God like create, like he should have just created the garden without the snake. Like why? Like it's God's fault. Like he's on his Gnostic. Like,
okay.
Yeah,
the snake was right. The snake did nothing wrong.
Right. The snake tells the truth and God is lying.
Yeah.
What's going on here? And the two things that Pageau said, the first one I agree with, the second one I disagree with.
What was the first?
The first one was, this is describing reality. What's your problem with it describing reality? And Alex O'Connor was like, no. You're positing. He was trying to make what he called an internal critique of your God isn't good enough. I would have designed a better God. and Pageau kept on saying to him, but this is describing reality. And O'Connor was like, I don't care about that.
I don't care about reality. I want to be God. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, Jacob, do you feel like that is where Alex O'Connor is coming from? Like, I would argue he's better faith than Dawkins.
Oh, look, this is a guy I think eventually is going to end up being religious, because he's genuinely wrestling with Genesis. And if someone's genuinely wrestling with Genesis, I have nothing to say with them, because God explained the story better than I can. I can help you learn Hebrew because I do believe that if you read it in Hebrew, you will get it much better than in translation. But that's about it. The second thing Pajot was trying to do was do that whole Christian spin of, well, it's really telling you about Jesus, right? Like, I don't even remember the narrative well enough to explain it, but like, so it's setting up the problem and Jesus is the answer. And
I would
yeah.
argue that Father Stephen DeYoung doesn't disagree with that, though.
I'm sure John Father Stephen DeYoung does not disagree with that.
No, I do actually disagree with it.
Oh, you do? Please.
Yes, I think that's a very Western Christian approach to it.
Really?
That the expulsion from paradise is the problem, and yeah.
No.
Like,
unfortunately, just to redirect focus my question. Not that that's the main problem, but that ultimately Jesus is in the background, foreshadowing that story as well.
But to me, that's like, doing
God
like the first 15 minutes of Avengers Endgame and then being like, and then Captain America picks up Thor's hammer. Like,
I got you.
There's a lot more in between there that you kind of skipped, right? Like,
that was a great scene, though.
I mean, from a Christian perspective, eventually you get to Jesus, the Messiah comes, right? But in order to even understand what that means, you need a lot more than the first 3 chapters of Genesis, right?
But to your first comment, though, which is like not seeing that as being the main problem, I'd like you to expand on that. I'm just throwing in there that in the Zohar, in the Kabbalistic texts, there is something called the secret of the deer, and the secret of the deer tells about a story how the crux of it in relation to into the story of Eden is that the deer is pregnant, but it's very nervous to give birth because of the birthing pains that are involved with giving birth. So it's basically it's prolonging the process. So God sends a serpent to bite the deer in its leg, and because it's startled by the serpent, it stops the focus on trying to keep the baby in, and the baby comes out and the story begins. And it's basically hinting to the fact that the fall, so to speak, is not necessarily a fall, rather more of a push, right? Like the snake is there by God's design, and the story needs to begin in some sort of way, and the snake and its whole interaction with Eve and Adam is not necessarily a wrongdoing, but sort of, again, like a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple pieces there. So my perspective on Genesis is that the first 11 chapters are setting up a whole series of problems and issues, right? All the way up through the Tower of Babel, the scattering of the nations, right? The flood, all of that. And then when you get to chapter 12 and you get to Abraham, that's now the beginning of the solution, right? God's now stepping in. But even the problems, right? The problems are not like things that were out of God's control. And then he's like, oh man, what am I going to do? Well, let me go talk to Abraham. Maybe he can help me out here and we could get something going. Right? Like, that's right. Like that is included, right? So any, like, from our perspective, right, this serpent is the devil, it's a demonic being, but even a demonic being ends up doing God's will despite itself, right? It may have evil intentions, right? But
so you're saying you believe in the sovereignty of God?
Well, yes, God is God.
So you're a Calvinist, I see.
Oh yeah, obviously, clearly, yeah. Aren't we all by that definition?
Yeah, but Father Stephen, was the fall avoidable? Like, or was that what was supposed to happen? Like, the game is only relevant with free will, with us playing in this arena, with us playing in. I'm using this term again from like a Kabbalistic perspective, but like, we need to be in the simulation to be able to interact in this game.
Right.
And if we were still in quote unquote the garden, then we wouldn't be playing this game.
Being expelled from paradise in the presence of God was part of God's plan for the destiny of humanity.
So is it a fall at that point?
Well, no, that's not that. That's why I say, like,
okay, Chezi, you're treading on really thin ice right now.
First of all, is that like a novel thing to happen on your channel?
Chezi, I mean, I don't want people to misunderstand what you're saying. It would have been better, and it was in fact possible for Adam and Eve not to sin.
Is that true? And again,
yes, that is definitely true, and this is not negotiable within Orthodox Judaism, Chezi.
But hence,
so I would say this is true, but even though we would affirm that for various theological reasons, I think maybe what Chezi is trying to get at is, like, in paradise, they probably had a completely different experience of time. At least, again, from my perspective, of the way the church fathers write about it.
Oh, even
right?
In Judaism.
That, you know, some of the church fathers, like St. Maximus the Confessor, says that there was, like, no actual time in the sense that we think about it that passed between the creation of humanity and the expulsion from paradise.
I mean, this
in the sense we think about it, the way we experience time now, right? So yes, I would affirm they could have made the other choice, right? But I also don't want that to imply a kind of literal reading like Alex O'Connor wants, that, like, they're literally standing around literal trees thinking, should I, you know, right? Like, that's right. I don't think that's what the story is getting at. But the story, like what St. Basil the Great says about it, is that that story is the perfect way for God to express the truths contained in it to us as human beings living in the world we live in with our ability to understand.
Jacob, I think I understand. I understand what you're saying about, like, you're on thin ice, but I would argue again, and there's a difference in what I'm walking around teaching in a school and what we're talking about right over here right now. And that's why I said that the secret of the deer is something that is not taught and is something that's very secretive.
Okay, but Chezi, there's a reason why there are certain fundamentals we teach, such as there is no punishment, anus rahmana pater. There is no punishment for something for a sin which you had no capacity to not perform. So did God know that Adam and Eve were in fact going to fall? Yes, he did know that, because God is outside of time. But it is fundamental and part of the 13 principles of Jewish faith to believe that Adam and Eve had a capacity not to sin, and that it is fundamental in Judaism that not sinning is better than sinning, despite the fact that God can do with our sins all that is great.
Yes, but I believe that
Paul of Tarsus said that in Romans. Anyway, go ahead.
The playing out of Adam and Eve not sinning is what we call life. That's what we're doing. We're trying to play that out right now, where we repent and we don't sin. But the initial quote unquote fall or push, or I mean, that goes back to our conversation with the angels and free will and the tension that humans have and angels have, which is how they view the world and how humans view the world. Which again, that's why I see it as a feature. So yes, we could call it a sin, and we could say the things that Father Stephen said and you reiterated with regards to when we say, you know, the Tetragrammaton is not that God knows the future. God is every moment of future, past, and present. So he is existing in every choice, in every decision, in every timeline. So yeah, and at that time, as the Midrash talks about it, where Adam is seeing the light from the beginning of the earth till the end of the earth, that all of Eden is happening inside God's head. All these are examples where like this is not a reality where we could be using the same terminology that we're speaking right now. So yes,
Chezi, I mean, this isn't just about the fall. You could ask the same thing about Joseph being sold into slavery. You could ask the same thing about the golden calf. Ultimately, right? The entire Bible is a story of God telling human beings not to sin, us sinning, and God still being able to make what is best through our incompetence. And so, like, it's not just a question of Adam and Eve in Eden.
Yes, you're right that like Joseph tells the brothers that ultimately everything God did, right, is for the good. However, I would argue that unlike the Greek dramas, right, where your destiny is sealed, that's not what the prophet's telling us. The prophets are telling us that if you don't change, bad things will happen. If you do change, good things will happen. And regardless, salvation will come. How quickly that happens and how that looks is up to you, right? So the whole story of Genesis is all about lack of communication between Adam and Eve, between the brothers, all the way down till we get to Joseph. And that's why the story of Exodus could only start after we could see at the end of Genesis that reconciliation is possible. Once
Okay,
reconciliation is possible,
but you realize you just said it was possible and it would be better if Adam and Eve did not sin.
But yes, but like just to qualify, the
There's
difference.
No buts there. That is
there
fundamental
is,
to how we understand the story.
So I'll give you the difference is when God tells Moses, "I'm done with the Israelites. I'm wrapping this up. I'm getting rid of all of them." Right? Moses comes as the new Noah and says, "No." With Noah asked, "You know what? Is my family and I going to be okay?" God says yes, and then everyone gets destroyed, and that's why Noah fails ultimately. Moses comes and says, "If you're going to do that, then get rid of me because I'm not interested in this game then." And then God says, "You know what? Oh, that's what I was waiting for. I was waiting to be challenged. I won't destroy them. That's what I wanted to see." Now, we could see that happening with Joseph. We could see that happening with with Moses. We could see that happening with Abraham. You don't hear that happening with Adam, and I'm not sure that we could use the same example that Adam also could have spoken back. I think at that level there was still a different. It was being played out differently where there was.
Oh no! Hold on. He could have definitely spoken back, and he did, and he said the precise wrong thing, which is it was her fault.
It wasn't me. It was this woman you put here.
Yeah. Right. So it's all part of the exact same story. I don't understand what you're trying to argue.
The difference is, okay, and I have to go on this note. The difference is the story we are being told on of Adam and Eve. While I know you and I, all three of us, or all four of us, definitely have some sense of like there was that actually happened. There's another sense where like we could be talking about like allegory, concepts, ideas, which are that story is different than the story of Moses talking to the Israelites. And that's why when I'm dealing with Moses talking with the Israelites, or you want to talk about like Alex O'Connor's camera, I would argue that Moses is talking to people and there's a guy named Moses. It's harder to have that conversation about like if there was a camera in Eden, would it have seen a tree? That's not something I could even conceptualize. And my argument is it would be silly to assume, yeah, it's a tree and there's bark to it. While talking about Moses' staff, we could talk about it from a symbolic point of view, but there was also probably a man holding a staff. And the question there, if what him getting angry or him speaking to God and praying is different than God asking Adam, where are you? So at that level, yeah.
Look, this is where, like, I don't understand how exactly things happened, and I don't need to understand how things exactly happened. If Moses was wearing a GoPro or Adam was wearing a GoPro, what I dislike is when people think that they have a better way of representing the story of Adam and Eve in a way that's fundamentally different from how the Bible presents them, in addition to the story of Moses. Moses wasn't wearing a GoPro, and Adam wasn't wearing a GoPro.
Yeah, but
and I
Jacob,
have no more capacity to reformulate the story of Adam than I do to reformulate the story of Moses.
yeah, but you could rely on, for all intents and purposes, right now, on, if you wanted to, on the rationalists like Maimonides, who will tell you those stories, right, of the flood and Adam and the Garden of Eden are not like the stories of Moses.
Look, if I'm talking to a rationalist, sure, I have been the number one person saying that if someone believes that Abraham wasn't an actual human being, that person can still be considered an Orthodox Jew. At the same time, I think that that's really an apologetic position, because frankly, to the best of my knowledge, there was an actual Adam and an actual Abraham,
right? So
actual Moses, right?
But Jacob, I was going to say your sources. You don't have to. Your sources give you give you the allowance to say there is an actual man named Abraham. There isn't an actual man named Adam.
But why do I want to go there?
The reason you would go there, and I'll ask this question to Father Stephen DeYoung, which is when we're talking about revelation, because ultimately that's the game at the end of the day, right? Did God speak to man? Is there revelation? The revelation that happens between the revelation that's happening at Sinai, or the revelation that's happening between God and Moses, I would argue is different than the revelation that's happening with Adam and Eve. That is not the same kind of speech that's happening. Arguably, I mean, the Zohar talks about how the revelation of Adam is even greater than Moses. That's the only revelation that's greater than Moses, according to one section. But Father Stephen Doug, would you see that in your context as well, that the revelation with Moses is different than the revelation with Adam?
No, but here's why.
Okay.
Because my understanding is that when Moses goes up Mount Sinai, he's entering paradise, because paradise is the place where God is. So when Mount Sinai is the mountain of God, right? He's speaking to God face to face, the way a man speaks to his friend. He's fundamentally in the same situation that Adam was in at that time.
But what about when he's just prophesizing then on the regular?
Well, that's interesting, because Moses then is exercising a particular kind of authority that begins with Moses. So, yeah, that's unique to Moses, in that Moses sets up the paradigm for that type of authority, right? In that God speaks to him, and then Moses has the authority to elaborate on it, and to make decisions, and to solve cases, and settle disputes and vagaries, right? And you see that over and over again. God says X, Y, Z, and then Moses will add, like, well, unless the firstborn animal is a donkey, you don't sacrifice the donkey because it's unclean. You sacrifice this instead. It doesn't record that God said anything about donkeys, right? But Moses has the authority to, like, settle that and issue that ruling. Laying out of hands, he passes that on to Joshua.
But what is, we just actually read that in this weekly portion right now, that he passes it on to Joshua. But so what is Abraham experiencing? What is Balaam, the prophet, experiencing?
Well, those are two very different cases.
I'm so
Like,
glad you're here to keep him on the orthodox Jewish path, Father Stephen.
No, but what do you?
Because without you, he would be going off into reform land. So thank you.
No, but I'm just saying those prophecies are different than Moses. Well, let's even put Balaam aside because in Judaism it's considered very similar to Moses. But let's say Abraham.
yeah. Well, so Abraham again is in a somewhat unique position because God appears to him over and over again.
Like he appears to Adam, you would say that it's the same. Like
not the same sense of Mount Sinai of him being in paradise when that happens. But that's also very different than just about everyone else. And you even see that over the course of the patriarchal narratives. He appears to Abraham, he appears to Isaac, he appears to Jacob. He appears in, like, he gives Joseph dreams.
Right, but they
right?
can manipulate that, so to speak. Right? Like Joseph gets dream when he's younger, misinterprets them, understands them better. I would say with Adam, it wasn't
Joseph,
like
yes.
But right, but so
Abraham stands and talks to him back and forth the way Moses does.
That first of all, that's true. And Balaam does that as well, by the way.
Yeah.
Which talks back to God.
Yeah. Whereas Joseph doesn't do that.
Correct.
Right. And his brother.
I would also say Joseph.
Right. Like
Joseph doesn't do that because he's a little traumatized, also by his dad when he's younger, telling him that like you're misinterpreting what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I think also Joseph is not as confident with his use of the force, so to speak, until he gets much older.
Yeah. But there's also a certain decline, right, that happens there, right, in terms of the directness of the relationship between God and Abraham is not mirrored by any of Joseph's brothers.
I am so glad we have an Eastern Orthodox priest here to explain to Chezi why Yeridat Hadorot is an actual thing that he should actually believe in, as opposed to his weird Zionist kefira.
I never once that all prophecies are the same. I clearly said that the prophecy of Moses is the greatest, aside from just claiming that it was different with Abraham, with Adam. And Father Stephen would agree that if like with Adam, it's closer to the source. Basically, it's more part of the original conversation, so to speak.
That he actually is in the presence of God,
right?
In the same way that Moses is on top of Mount Sinai.
And I would argue that when you're in the presence of God, right, and you see this a little with the golden calf, and that's why the relationship is never the same after the golden calf, which is like, if you're literally speaking to me face to face, then yeah, if you transgress, you got to go. Like if you sinned in Eden, where everything was offered to you, then the stakes are as high as they could possibly be. Then you get kicked out.
Well,
if you just received the tablets, or you're about to receive the tablets, you heard my voice from Mount Sinai, and yet you still get confused enough to go over this golden calf, then there really can't be a conversation anymore. And as the generations, as we get further and further away from that voice, there's more of a tolerance for our sinning. There's more of a tolerance for our transgressions because obviously we no longer hear the voice anymore. Right now we're using intellectual tricks to try to scratch at what prophecy or the embodiment of prophecy would have felt like or would have looked like. But I still maintain the fact that the whole conversation with Adam and the whole story in Eden is we can't use the same tools that we do when we're discussing the relationship that God has with the Israelites or the relationship God has with Moses or the other prophets.
Well, you can't leave out the sanctuary though either, right? Because that's critically important in the Torah that Moses, goes up outside, the people can't come near it. Right. Adam and well, Asha at that point, but are put out of paradise, right? Because they're sinful. And then the whole context of the sanctuary is emphasized by Nadab and Abihu when you get to Leviticus is what do we have to do? What is the level of holiness and repentance we have to maintain in order to be able to come back into the presence of God even once a year, right? Or to draw at least close, right, with the Levites and the priests for worship. And then what's the level that has to be maintained by the Israelite people in the camp as opposed to the nations outside the camp, right? That you have these different levels of like sanctity to allow you to reapproach. So the way back into paradise is like enacted in the tabernacle and later in the temple under Solomon, right? The goal is to come back again, right?
First of all, for sure the goal is to come back, and there's even an interpretation that Nadav and Avihu actually, they reached their goal. They're even at a holier state than Moses and Aaron, according to one of the interpretations, which is like they got what they wanted. They were taken away, like, you know, by like their spirit went back to the God, and they wanted to be like as close as possible. And ultimately, as close as possible means like you're no longer here. It means like you need to go to the next place. And this is also what Moses warns. So the 250 posse of Korach, they come and say, we want to also bring in this incense. And the sages ask, they're like, what, were they idiots? Like, did they not know the risks they're taking? And it says like, no, they're actually very wise, and they knew the risks they're taking. And Moses says, we could see, you know, orient yourself properly, bring your incense, and we'll see who God respects. And it could be Moses saying, it could be I'm wrong, and you guys are perfectly oriented, and then it's going to be a success. Or I'm not wrong, and he literally says, you're playing with fire. So like you're playing with the holy fire. So if you want to get close, you guys all might burn, and that's ultimately what happens. And that's the risk they took, because they said, we want to get as close as possible. So I agree with you that we're always wanting to return. This is also built into our prayers, obviously, with sequences that are going back to prophetic texts. So we're trying to ultimately get back to the source. But again, even for us who don't hear the sound of prophecy anymore, I would hope God's patience with us is different than it was with the patriarchs.
Well, so this is, you know, Jacob's favorite Jewish person, Saul of Tarsus.
Yeah.
Talks about the purpose of the Torah being given as being related to the experience of the patriarchs, right? That the experience of the patriarchs and that sort of diminution as you get toward Joseph and his brothers helps show the need for God to sort of reveal himself, right, more fully, more broadly, right, to the people, right, in order to, because of the issues with sin, because of the issues with, right, that sort of hound those narratives, right, that part of what's going on in Genesis as prologue to the Torah as a whole is showing the need for Torah, right?
Well, Torah,
right?
Torah expressed that way, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, continuing with what you're saying, we would believe that the patriarchs or other great or the heroes, so to speak, were all versions of embodiment of the Torah in their sense, right? I mean, there's a fail with Enoch, there's a fail with Noah. Obviously, it's more successful with Abraham, but like we said earlier, once God sees that communication is possible with the brothers, then there's a sense where, like, yes, they actually need. And we also see this teased out in the text. Moses comes and frees the Israelites, and so far they're with him because they were told that a savior would come and release them and take them back to the promised land. There's never a discussion, though, about commandments and rules. That's not something they know about. And when Moses goes to them and say, okay, now that I release you, we're gonna go to this mountain, and they respond to him, everything God says we're gonna do, which is like, so far we could trust you for being like the savior. About all these rules and these conversations, I don't know what you're talking about, man. Like, so when we hear it from the voice, then we'll could talk about it. But that was something that was added on later, when there's a sense where, like, okay, I see that this needs to be spelled out, so to speak, how to actually practice it and how to actually do this. And that goes all the way down through the prophets, where we start seeing the return. When we get to the prophets, we start hearing, like, you know what? I actually don't need your sacrifices. Like, I see, like, where, like, we didn't have sacrifices, then sacrifices made sense, then it was necessary, and now it's almost no longer necessary. You guys have corrupted that process as well. So hopefully we're learning a new language.
Right.
Pure
The
speech,
sacrifices
so to
never
speak.
did it itself. Yeah. But this is good that we're having this conversation, because if you're in on it, when we finally have this Romans 7 conversation,
I'm in on
right,
it.
if in order to understand what Paul is doing, right, a big part of Paul's argument is that he sees Jesus as his argument that Jesus is the Messiah. A major part of it is that he sees Jesus as a full embodiment of the Torah.
Right.
Which obviously you're going to disagree with. So we're going to have to frame that discussion in terms of not, you know, do you agree with him that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah? But in terms of if a Jewish person believed that, does his argument make sense?
Well, I would,
Right?
and on this I really have to end that the Zohar says God, Israel, and the Torah are one.
Yes.
Right. So
yes,
that's
those are the three parts of Paul's argument.
In the Jewish text,
argument is that Jesus is the embodiment of the God of Israel, the embodiment of the Torah, and the embodiment of the people of Israel.
Before Chezi goes, Father Stephen, since you've been so good on keeping him within the lines of Orthodox Judaism, I wanted to ask you, do you think Chezi should go and take his smicha exam to be ordained? As everyone keeps on saying to him that he should go and take his stupid exam.
I mean, you're talking to a person who's working on his second PhD. So I'm a very pro-credential person.
And it would be good if Chezi was Rabbi Chezi Spiro, so that he could continue teaching Torah to all the people who come to learn from him, right, Father Stephen?